1793, the Chicago Limited Express left New York for the metropolis of the West. A writer for Harper's Weekly was aboard one of George Pullman's luxurious sleeping cars, made in Chicago. The Belgian linen and fine English china came from Chicago's merchant prince, Marshall Field. The menu featured beef and pork from Swift and Armour, Chicago's famous meat packers. The writer enjoyed the best the miraculous city could offer. The city that had opened the prairies and transformed the continent. The city that seemed to portend the future, for better or worse.
Chicago was the shock city of America, and some reacted to that vision of the future with horror. This is not the place we want to go. This is not what we want to be. And others with great excitement. This is what the world was becoming. It was a world of endless opportunity.
He was headed for this city of opportunity that lured people from the East.
The architect Louis Sullivan thrust his hand up in the air and said, "This is the place for me."
The city of opportunity that lured people from 14 nations.
They were pulled out to Chicago to do the dirtiest, hardest work imaginable. And they were despised for it.
He was headed for the lawless city where politics was more than ballots.
The term right-hand man, I really believe, started in Chicago because you wanted someone who had a good right. It was a tough business, politics.
The explosive city of the new industrial age where there were no rules in the battle between capital and labor.
They were revolutionaries. They felt that perhaps with a single act of violence, capital would just crumble and a new society would take shape.
The city where people, driven by profit, were blind to nature.
Chicago is situated magnificently for trade, but it's a pestilential swamp. It's a horrible place for a city. It's an absolute hellhole.
Children were playing with maggots as if they were little pets.
The Harper's writer was bound for the World's Columbian Exposition, celebrating the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage of discovery. It would be the grandest World's Fair ever. No matter what the wonders of the fair, he alerted his readers, Chicago itself will be the most surprising.
Chicago is a crucible for the larger transformations that the country was undergoing. From agriculture to industry, rural isolation to the crowding of urban life, from the seasons and the movements of the sun dictating our rhythms to the movements of the punch clock. All of those will come to define America, and all of those are on display in the city of the century that was Chicago.
In 1673, French explorers Jacques Marquette and Louis Joliet paddled 40 days up the Mississippi River to the Illinois. They were returning to Quebec from a voyage of discovery the first white men to descend and map the Mississippi. The French hoped to wrest the continent from the British before they pushed west from their colonies in the east. "We have seen nothing like this river," Marquette wrote of the earthly paradise they encountered west of the Illinois. Marquette was a Catholic missionary. His converts would also make good allies. "There are great prairies," noted Joliet, a geographer, "with grass 5 or 6 feet high." They had discovered the tall grass prairies, an ocean of grass that flowed for 1,000 miles to the Rocky Mountains. They had paddled from the St. Lawrence River over the Great Lakes to what is now Green Bay, Wisconsin. They made an arduous portage up rapids and waterfalls to a continental divide, then descended to the Mississippi. Now, the Indians showed them an easier route back. Up the Illinois River, then the Des Plaines, to where it ended in a marshy height of land.
You would never imagine that it was a continental divide of any kind, and yet the marsh was sitting right on the line that flowed both to the Mississippi and into the St. Lawrence. At high water times, in fact, that marsh emptied into both, so that at the highest of waters, you could probably canoe directly from Lake Michigan on into the Mississippi watershed, which is amazing.
Marquette and Joliet reached the divide in September at low water, and they portaged for a few miles, but only a few feet above the marsh. Joliet would recommend to the French in Quebec a canal for canoes that would avoid the portage, a canal that would link the St. Lawrence to the Mississippi. East of the portage was a sluggish river which flowed through a swamp. The Indians called it Chicagua, the place of the wild onion, or skunkweed.
It stunk. It had a foul odor. The river is almost motionless, and this stinking weed gave off this odor that drove even the Indians away. And they're not going to live on a bog. You know, there's plenty of open prairie there and grassland and things like that, and little prairie woodlands. Only the white man's crazy enough to live there.
When the voyagers reached the lake, they began the 1,500-mile trek back to Quebec. Joliet was the first to see the potential of the stinking river at the portage. He would urge the French to return and create a colony. In their war with the British, he knew it could command the continent. The French lost their battle for North America, and for a century, Chicago remained unsettled. A black man arrived around 1780 to farm and trade with the Indians at the mouth of the river. Son of a French father and a Haitian mother, Jean-Baptiste Point de Sable prospered for 20 years. His house had a piano. No one knows why he headed west in 1800. Some say he was disappointed the Indians did not make him a chief. Chicago was a fur trading post out on the rim until the 1830s. It had no church or schoolhouse. It did have a fort, Fort Dearborn, and 3 taverns. The Saguenash Hotel was the most raucous. It was run by Marc Beaubien, part French, part Indian. "I play the fiddle like the devil," he would say, "and I keeps hotel like hell." It was good enough for Gurdon Saltonstall Hubbard, a transplanted Vermonter and one of the first Yankee settlers. The Indians called him Swift Walker. Hubbard and his Indian wife bounded 125 miles from the Wabash Valley with pelts destined for New York. When the fur trade dried up, he drove pigs.
Everybody mixed together at the Sauganash Inn. Beaubien would get the music going. Officers from the fort would come down by ferry boat or by canoe to the Sauganash, and they'd be swinging around the floor with Indian maidens, and these tight-buttoned people from the east would come occasionally, roll through Chicago, and they'd be scandalized by this. Women drinking Applejack straight out of the bottle, copulating out in the backyard, squaws and soldiers, people sleeping on the porch. Beaubien said in his old age, he said, they were great times, they were great times. No more of that sort of stuff anymore. He'd hold wrestling matches on the lawn.
Entertainment would have consisted of hunting, or maybe foot racing, or horse racing, drinking, gambling, and listening to wolves and bears at night, because the city was ringed with small forests as well as marshland. But this was life on the rim. This was the frontier during the period of fur trading.
The days of this way of life were numbered. America was pushing west. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, opened an easy route from New York to the center of the country. The new state of Illinois already envisioned, as Joliet had, a canal that would link the Mississippi to the Great Lakes at Chicago.
This location on Lake Michigan would be one of the endpoints of that canal, thereby linking New Orleans and the Mississippi River with the Great Lakes, the Erie Canal, the Hudson, and New York, so that there would now be a way of delivering all the produce of the interior of North America right into the waiting hands of New York. And Chicago, this location, would be the partner of that New York growth.
The Indians had to go. The Potawatomis were forced to give up 5 million acres they had occupied a century before Marquette and Joliet reached Chicago. U.S. Indian agents plied the chiefs with liquor so they would sign. Traders plied them with liquor to swindle them of their new bounty. On a September evening in 1833, the Indian agents faced west toward the land they would acquire. The chiefs, at least 2 staggering drunk, drew their marks on the treaty papers. The dusky nuisances, as the new landowners considered them, were banished west of the Mississippi. The French and half-breeds followed. The history of Chicago can be written from 1833 forward, an historian would write, as if they had never lived there. U.S. surveyors imposed a grid on the town and the surrounding grasslands. Canal commissioners, Gurdon Hubbard among them, sold lots to finance the canal. They preserved a narrow stretch along the lake for public enjoyment, a common to remain forever open, free of any buildings or obstruction. The prospect of the canal enticed the first wave of Easterners who would dominate Chicago for decades. Yankee speculators from New York and New England.
Most of them started off as hustlers. Nothing wrong with that. Speculative hustlers. Those are the people who built Chicago. It wasn't coming in with moneyed wealth. These are people who made their money here. They came perhaps from the East to make it here, and that's where they made it. But they were working the street. No doubt about it.
Men bought land for $100 or $200 in the morning and sold it for several thousand in the afternoon.
They're Yankees, they're Protestants, they're interested in one thing, in making money, and they're risk takers. Hardly any of them expected to stay. It'd be the type of town they thought where they could come in, make a killing, and get out. But they did stay, and they built a city.
William Butler Ogden was first among them. When his father had a stroke, Ogden, age 16, took over his lumber and real estate business in the mountains of southern New York. His struggle to survive, he later recalled, prepared him for life on the frontier. Ogden came to Chicago to oversee land purchased by his brother-in-law and other Wall Street investors.
He goes out, checks the property, finds himself ankle-deep in mud, writes back to his brother-in-law, "You've been victim of the worst kind of folly." Lo and behold, Ogden gets to work, is able to sell or to recoup his brother-in-law's investment by just selling off 1/3 of the land. And he went, maybe it's worth staying.
In 1837, Chicago was incorporated as a city. Gurdon Saltonstall Hubbard, who had abandoned his Indian wife and married a white woman, traded his moccasins for a topcoat and joined the newcomers. The newcomers were a majority, and William Butler Ogden, just 6 months in town, became Chicago's first mayor. To overcome its isolation, Chicago had to reach out, east and west. The mouth of the river was dredged to create a harbor. Hubbard joined a shipping company to establish regular service to Buffalo. His lake schooners brought more speculators who stayed in town and farmers who passed through it to plow the tall grass prairies. Plank roads were built over the mud so they could bring their hams and apples to town and return with a potbelly stove. In 1840, a lawyer from Vermont spoke of magical changes. In 7 years, a French and Indian trading post of 300 had become an Anglo-American town of 4,000. Irish immigrants who had dug the Erie Canal came to Chicago in 1836 to dig the Illinois and Michigan Canal.
The Irish who came to Chicago were in large measure very poor. They had few skills, little that would have allowed them to negotiate an urban setting easily. And they were pulled out to Chicago to do the dirtiest, hardest work that was imaginable. And they were despised for it.
One reporter called the Irish not merely ignorant and poor, but drunken, dirty, indolent, and riotous, so as to be the object of dislike and fear to all. They often did demand whiskey on the job. They also dug a canal almost 100 miles long, plagued by malaria, rattlesnakes, mosquitoes, and leeches. That was the easy part. In 1838 alone, up to 1,000 canal workers died. Their graves are few, their stories unrecorded. The canal was financed with land sales in communities planned along its route. The sudden growth of Bridgeport, where the canal joins the south branch of the Chicago River, was unplanned.
Sometimes when the project ran out of money, they paid people in land script. And many of the Irish took the money they were owed in land and settled at the area where the bridge went across, at the port of the canal, which has become modern-day Bridgeport. If the project itself had been more successful financially and better organized, there's no telling where the Irish would have moved after this. They could have gone out to Utah and dug ditches for the Mormons.
You'll get the point of order.
Bridgeport remains the spiritual center of Irish Chicago.
As long as I'm mayor, no one will be stepped on.
It was home to 5 20th century mayors.
That goes for you, too.
In April 1848, the General Thornton, a canal boat from New Orleans, arrived in Chicago with a cargo of sugar and produce headed for Buffalo. Its arrival there was heralded in Washington by a young congressman from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. Joliet had dreamed of a water route from the Gulf of Mexico to Montreal. It ended instead in New York. The Illinois and Michigan Canal spared migrants the bumpy trip by horse and wagon west to the prairies and brought their produce back to Chicago. The prospect of the canal had created Chicago, luring investors like William Butler Ogden. But by the time the canal opened in 1848, Ogden had switched his bet and built a railroad to the prairies.
Ogden found that Eastern financiers were not interested in the railroad. It seemed to have relatively limited prospects, and so he went out in his buggy along the prospective route and talked farmers into buying stock.
And they're knocking on farmers' doors and the doors of businessmen who own land on the route and saying, look, we're going to run a railroad through here, give us right-of-way, become an investor by giving us right-of-way, give us money, and we'll give you shares in our company.
Ogden raised $350,000 and bought a rickety locomotive, the Pioneer, which would run on wooden tracks with metal caps. On November 20th, 1848, the Pioneer chugged west for 8 miles to the end of the line. Along the way, it met a farmer with a wagon load of wheat. It became the first wheat brought by train to Chicago. On the next trip, farmers overwhelmed the train with 30 carloads. It was men like Ogden, who became the city's leading citizen as much as Chicago's location, that would make it the great city of the Midwest.
Any one of those small towns surrounding Chicago, out there on the rim of civilization, have equally propitious locations. But there's something about Chicago that triggers an economic revolution, where an economic revolution isn't triggered in a place like Kenosha. And it's hard to say exactly why, but there is this wonderful synergy, this combination of people of energy, risk takers, who come to that place. They see city building as a supremely human art, and they see that they have a chance here to turn this prairie bog into a great city.
To make Chicago attractive to newcomers like himself, Ogden and the Eastern elite supported civic and cultural institutions, among them hospitals, orphanages, and the Chicago Historical Society. All on the north side of the river where they lived, not in Bridgeport where the Irish lived. Ogden raised money for new streets and wooden plank sidewalks. To accommodate canal traffic, he pushed for bridges, swing bridges, anchored in the middle of the river. The motivation was selfish as well as civic. Ogden could not forget, a friend remembered, that everything which benefited Chicago benefited him. The location of his city was suited for commerce, not for habitation. It was so wet in the spring that horses had to be dug out of mud pits. Signs read, "No bottom here," and "Shortest road to China." Scavenging pigs were the frontier city's answer to the garbage problem. This was 1848, the year of the canal and Ogden's Railroad, the year that Chicago began to use its strategic location to build a commercial empire that would change America. The year the young city opened its first important factory on the north side of the river. In 1831, Cyrus Hall McCormick, son of a Virginia farmer, had built a primitive reaper, overcoming problems that had plagued farmers for centuries, cutting grain by hand, one hand with a sickle, two with a scythe. He sensed the best market for his reaper would be farther west, on the vast wheat fields of Illinois.
Farmers would set in a wheat crop. That's no problem. The planting, it's the harvesting that's the problem. They're out there with their boys and their cousins and a couple of their neighbors cutting wheat with a sickle and a scythe. And they can't cut the wheat fast enough. And a lot of the wheat simply dies in the field. And McCormick, when he toured on foot the Midwest, saw this happening, saw farmers losing because they couldn't bring in the wheat fast enough. And here he sees a great chance.
The first year, McCormick made 450 reapers, none the same, each blade forged by hand. With 120 employees, he was Chicago's largest employer. But no one worked harder. There by the furnace fire, begrimed with coal and dust, decorated with an apron of leather, wrote the Chicago Daily Journal, stood the one in charge of it all, Cyrus Hall McCormick. The paper called the reaper a mechanical man. It freed farmers worldwide from their bondage to the sickle and scythe, and helped open the Midwest. Chicago revolutionized not only the production of grain, but how it was transported and traded. Farmers who cut grain with McCormick's first reapers loaded their sacks onto wagons and headed off to a stream. There the grain would be reloaded onto rafts and floated downriver until it reached the Mississippi.
Once these rafts have reached the Mississippi, all the grain is taken off in the sacks, loaded onto the shore of the river, and then they're carried once again into the holds of small boats that are on the upper Mississippi River, and there they are carried on down to St. Louis, where they're unloaded yet again, put out onto the levee in St. Louis, and then loaded yet again by hand in somebody's back, carried onto a larger steamship, which will carry it on down to New Orleans, where it's unloaded yet again, and put onto an ocean-going vessel to New York or to the North Atlantic economy and on to Europe. There's a huge amount of labor cost, and so this is a very expensive way to move grain.
The railroad overcame the constraints of geography. As plank roads had reached out to farmers a few miles, railroads from Chicago reached out hundreds of miles, cutting into the hinterland of St. Louis. In the decade after Ogden's Chicago and Galena Union headed out toward the Mississippi, New York investors financed railroads that spread out from Chicago like tentacles. By 1856, Chicago had become the railroad hub of America.
What made Chicago so special was that the web of railroads that were being projected west dumped everything into Chicago's lap. It became the funnel that delivered an entire ecosystem, the entire western landscape, into the waiting markets of the eastern seaboard of the United States and of Europe.
They seem so commonplace today, the picturesque hallmark of every rural town. But in the 19th century, the grain elevator was a revolutionary technology that transformed the handling of grain around the world and doomed the sack. Grain elevators were developed in Buffalo. Chicago built its first in 1848. By 1858, 12 mammoth grain houses dominated its skyline. When poet Carl Sandburg called Chicago a stacker of wheat, he was referring to grain elevators, the city's first skyscrapers. Grain flowed from the elevators into the holds of lake boats to be shipped east, where it was refined. What became a golden stream in Chicago still moved by sack on the backs of laborers in St. Louis. In the 1840s, it had taken an Irish crew all day to load a boat with 7,000 bushels of wheat. A decade later, the same amount could be loaded in an hour by one man. Six years after its canal, first railroad, and grain elevator, Chicago surpassed St. Louis in the grain trade. 10 years after McCormick built his factory, the Mississippi Valley was the world's largest food-producing region. Chicago became known as the Great Reaper City. Its port replaced Archangel and Odessa in Russia as the greatest grain port in the world. The Chicago River became a mammoth exchange engine. Ships heading east with grain from the west passed fleets carrying lumber from the north. Its location on the southern tip of Lake Michigan made a lumber market possible. Farmers in the fertile but treeless prairies hungered for lumber, for fences and barns. It came from the north end of the lake, where the white pine forests of Michigan and Wisconsin seemed endless. By the time of the Civil War, Chicago had become the largest lumber market in the world.
The scene on the south branch of the Chicago River, you cannot witness anymore. It does not exist in Chicago. It doesn't exist, actually, I think, anywhere in the world. Stack after stack after stack of lumber, all waiting to be shipped on downstate in Illinois, out to Iowa, on to Nebraska or Kansas. A whole district just devoted to stacked lumber.
There are cases where entire prairie families are standing out there in this windswept prairie bog, waiting for their town to arrive. Bar, chapel, houses, it's already made in Chicago. It's stamped on it, made in Chicago, along with the reapers and everything else. They're just standing there with their kids, you know, waiting for that train. Here comes the town.
Within a single generation, Chicago had turned the tall grass prairies, the earthly paradise Joliet and Marquette had admired, into the American Midwest. The city that was transforming America became a hellhole. By the late 1850s, 104 trains a day steamed everywhere, turning Chicago into a smoky and dangerous wasteland.
You know, in New York City, they had to stop at 42nd Street. Vanderbilt, a powerhouse, has to build a train station there. And if he wants to take cars further south, he's got to pull them by mules down to Wall Street. But in Chicago, the train just kept roaring right into town, smoke blowing all over the place. They're killing 2 and 3 people a day there. It's like an Australian said, human life is secondary to making money in Chicago. So they run over a couple of people.
When the Illinois Central wanted tracks along the lakefront, Gurdon Saltonstall Hubbard was one of a few who fought to keep it as a park, forever free. The railroad was forced to build a trestle. The lakeside remained bucolic, but the docking area by the railroad's riverside terminal became filled with industrial debris and bloated corpses of horses and cattle. In the 1850s, railroads brought immigrants in overwhelming numbers. Many were Germans who arrived with industrial skills and money. They found jobs as butchers, furniture makers, and metal workers, and became by 1870 the largest immigrant group. Despite the language barrier, Germans fit more easily into urban life than the impoverished Irish. When the canal was complete, the Irish built the railroads. They also worked as unskilled laborers in factories like McCormick's Reaper Works. They spread out from Bridgeport, but always to slums along the south branch of the Stinking River, where the factories were. The Germans lived north of the river. When the Irish moved to the north side, the Germans moved farther north. A small number of black Americans settled near a vice district on the north side. The city refused to enforce the law to return fugitive slaves. At the close of 1857, Chicago was the largest city in what was then called the Northwest. It had grown from 4,000 to 93,000 in 20 years, the result of unbridled capitalism. A visiting Swedish novelist called Chicago one of the most miserable and ugly cities which I have yet seen in America. A woman writing for Boston's Atlantic Monthly was shocked that it had no public park, no gallery of art, no establishment of music, no social institution whatever except the church. She noticed an appearance of extreme hurry on the streets, but the scarcity of women made them seem, she wrote, forlorn. In this scarcity, another saw opportunity. Potter Palmer had fled a Quaker village in Albany County before finishing school because it was dull. In 1852, he left a dry goods store in Lockport, New York, headed west, and observed the scene on Lake Street. Palmer was impressed by the bustle of mud-splattered farm carts, overburdened prairie freighters, salesmen lugging carpet bags stuffed with samples. Most of all, by the few women shoppers lifting their calico skirts above the mud. He signed a lease. Where there had been few women, Palmer hoped to lure more.
As men and women poured into the city to take advantage of commercial opportunities, Potter Palmer understood that many of those women had not only the time, but also the income to shop, to do what today we think of as recreational consumption. And he created the department store in which that happened.
At a time when women would never enter a restaurant alone, they did shop unescorted. Palmer greeted them at the door, ushered them around the store, remembering their tastes and the names of their pets. He tantalized them with upscale merchandise he purchased in Europe. He was the first city storekeeper to advertise extensively, to run sales or bargain days. He guaranteed a full cash refund, a practice that other merchants were forced to copy if they hoped to compete with the intruder, as Palmer had come to be known. There was one problem. The store on Lake Street was 1 block from the river.
1 block from the river. You could catch the smell of the river. And women, when they shopped at his shop, would put handkerchiefs over their nose.
By 1867, Palmer was Chicago's first merchant prince. He secretly bought all the property along a squalid street which ran away from the river, parallel to the lake. State Street was the trail along which Gurdon Saltonstall Hubbard had driven his hogs from the Wabash Valley. Then he convinced the city council to widen it. Palmer wanted to reorient the city's business district and create a Broadway for Chicago. He built Palmer's Palace, a marble-faced emporium with Corinthian columns, rented it to his new partners, and left retailing for real estate. Many considered the $50,000 a year rent exorbitant. His young partners Levi Leiter and Marshall Field did not. Marshall Field would build on Palmer's methods to become Chicago's commercial giant, a power that even the elite, and especially immigrant workers, would cross at their peril. For much of the 19th century, Americans knew where their bacon came from. They saw the pigs in local pastures, knew the farmer who fed them, and the butcher who killed them. It was a familiar world, rooted in nature. Even when a pork industry developed in the 1850s, it was dependent on nature and the seasons. As grain was shipped to St. Louis, pigs were shipped to Cincinnati by river. Plants were busy in the winter, idle in the summer, when meat was likely to spoil. Chicago turned this world on its head. Railroads bypassed the rivers to divert hogs to Chicago. Packers like Gurdon Hubbard found a way to bypass the seasons, to turn summer into winter.
They begin cutting ice on the streams, rivers, ponds around Chicago, and then eventually in Indiana and Illinois and Wisconsin, and bringing that ice down to Chicago so that the pork packing factories can be kept open all year long.
Boosted by pork sales to the Union Army in the Civil War, Chicago surpassed Cincinnati as Porkopolis by 1862. Hogs from the Midwest funneled into its Union stockyards, which opened Christmas Day, 1865, and soon had 2,300 pens for 75,000 hogs. What they faced next was a process that would change American industry, and it smelled.
The smell in the holding pens, of course, was incredible. But the smell of the processing is what most people really remember, because that processing smell is what permeated everything. My mother used to say that you'd never die of pneumonia because no germs could live in your lungs if you grew up in back of the yards. I grew up in the back of the yards, and the smell never really bothered me because it was always there. The first time I went out as a young boy, they took us out on a picnic to the country. I got sick because I smelled fresh air. It was so strange.
The Hereford wheel was invented in Cincinnati. Chicago packers perfected it. Shackled by a hind leg, the hogs were lifted into the air. A sticker would then slit their throats. were so excessively alive, these pigs, poet Rudyard Kipling would write. And then they were so excessively dead. And the man in the dripping, clammy, hot passage did not seem to care. And ere the blood of one had ceased to foam on the floor, another, and 4 friends with him, had shrieked and died.
When the Hereford wheel is introduced, the hog kill becomes the loudest kill in the packing houses. Pigs are very intelligent. When that Hereford wheel grabbed them, they know something's going on. And they let out a blood-curdling, incredible scream.
From the kill to the cutlets, pork packing developed into a labor-intensive, lightning-fast disassembly line.
In about 15 minutes, the hog goes through this process of passing about 125 or 150 people, depending on the packing house. And you've got, by the turn of the century, meat packing houses in Chicago that are killing 5,000-6,000 hogs a day, which would be the whole week's kill in a previous generation. The largest run of hogs, the Union stockyards, was about 190,000 hogs in one day.
The largest of the pork packers was Armour and Company, which shipped all over the world. "I give more people food than any other man alive," Philip Armour told his sons.
He has a pork packing empire of global scope, and he can keep in communication with it through the transatlantic cable, which is laid in the 1860, telegraph line, and the telephone. So you can now run a global industry. We always think of the great global industries as oil and steel, but the first of these great global industries is pork packing.
Son of a farmer from Stockbridge, New York, Philip Armour was tossed out of school for taking a buggy ride with a girl. He joined the gold rush in California and made enough to enter the grain and pork business in Milwaukee. He poured his profits into a packing plant alongside the Union stockyards and undermined packers like Gurdon Hubbard, who could not compete. Philip Armour was all business.
You get up in the morning, eat a simple breakfast, read all the reports, be in the office at 6:30 in the morning. If you came in after 9 o'clock, he'd greet you with a booming "good afternoon." And he said he'd get there before 9 o'clock. He said before the guys with the polished nails get there. He says that's when the work gets done. And he was bouncing around from desk to desk, and he had his finger in every aspect of the business. And this is the business that made Chicago. This is what it was known for, hog butcher of the world. And Armour was the epitomization of that sort of thing.
In Philip Armour's Chicago, they did it straight, Norman Mailer would write. They cut the animals right out of their hearts, which is why it was the last of the great American cities. And people had great faces, carnal as blood, greedy, direct, too impatient for hypocrisy, in love with honest plunder. The Chicago packing houses became the largest killing fields in the world, and Chicago's foremost tourist attraction. A person could visit the grain elevators or lumber yards without pondering their meaning. Not the stockyards. Here they realized the familiar world of the pig, the pasture, and the butcher they knew was gone, replaced by the cold-hearted mechanization of slaughter. Dissection so complete that, as Philip Armour said, nothing was left but the squeal.
And you wonder what it was that would make that an attractive thing for a tourist to see. And yet, this was new. This was the modern. This was the Industrial Revolution at its most dramatic, its starkest. And I think people went there both to be repelled by it, both to be horrified on the one hand, but also to wonder at what this age had accomplished and what was happening to the world as a result.
The disassembly line repelled novelist Upton Sinclair. One could not stand and watch very long without becoming philosophical, he wrote in The Jungle, without beginning to hear the hog squeal of the universe. It intrigued Henry Ford. In the disassembly line of the Chicago Packers, he wrote in his autobiography, he found the inspiration for the assembly line for his Model T. Chicago developed as a trading center, a crossroads between producers and buyers. At first, they traded what was present in the city. Hogs were bought and sold at the Union stockyards. Grain traders developed a board of trade where they bought and sold receipts for grain deposited in the elevators by the river. A telegraph in the trading room gave New York buyers instant market reports. They bought grain in the elevators for future delivery. Speculators then developed a futures market. A buyer in New York could buy for future delivery Chicago hogs or grain that did not yet exist. It was a market not in hogs, but in the future price of hogs. One bought or sold not wheat or corn, but gambled on their prices at a future date. As one historian explained, the futures market was a place where men who don't own something are selling that something to men who don't really want it.
Go to the Chicago Board of Trade today, and you will see one of the most extraordinary monuments to world capitalism that you can see anywhere on Earth. It's an amazing scene. What will be happening down on that floor are people buying and selling commodities and products from ecosystems and economies all over the world, setting prices that determine the future for people all over the world. And yet, you look at it and you don't have a clue all the elements that are coming together there. It is where the world connects in the modern age, and it is where that connection is rendered invisible in the modern age.